Hi, good evening. You're watching BloombergQuint. Now, it is days away from the budget. And of course, this is a pre-budget conversation because we're just days away. But in this conversation, which is really about the tax architecture in India, we're not going to ask our guests on whether capital gains tax needs to change or STT needs to go up. What we're trying to take a look at is how equitable our tax system is. Does it serve the full purpose that it ought to as the key contributor of revenue for an economy? And within its subsections, between direct and indirect tax, or within direct tax itself, does a sense of fairness play through? Well, to discuss this with me today, this evening, is DK Pant. He's Chief Economist at India Ratings, and Sachchidanand Shukla. He's Chief Economist at the Mahindra Group. So, Mr. Pant, Mr. Shukla, thank you very much for joining us here at BloombergQuint. I admit that on the face of it, it looks like a fuzzy topic, right? I don't have specific questions. Will Section 80C change? Will this go up? Will that go down? I think what I'm asking for you to look at is the big picture view of our tax architecture, both direct and indirect, and where it needs to shift given the imperatives that this economy is facing. I'll start with you first, Mr. Pant. Our tax collections this year have been good, and that's great news. We are going to exceed our targets for the budgeted estimates. Again, great news. But when you look at the overall trend, our tax to GDP ratio continues to be in the lower band amongst countries, and it is a very, very meager number. How do you look at what the tax system is delivering to the economy?
Look, Milka, you're right. This year tax collections have been good. They will surpass the budget target. Whether next year will be good or not, we'll come to know that. But unlikely that next year will be as buoyant as we are in this year. Tax collection, in fact, if you look at India has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the world. There are many reasons for that. First region being agriculture totally being out of it. So it's just 15% of the gross value addition. There are a lot of unorganized, unregistered MSMEs, which are, because being very small, are out of tax net. So I'm not saying that painting everyone at the same brush, like the people say MSME doesn't pay taxes. I'm not saying that. But since they are such small MSMEs, they are outside tax net. Now, why taxes are so important? Why revenues are so important for the economy? Because the kind of development needs we have. Whether we should have more direct taxes? Yes. Can we have more direct taxes? Then let's go back. How corporate tax? We had done 2 years back corporate tax rate cut. And then we have done it at a time when we were on the down cycle of the growth down cycle. All right. Now, if you look at last year or this year, the corporate performance has been pretty good. But is it the tax collection performance is of the same order? Unlikely. Because when you compare it with 2 years back, they are not the same. Now, since your corporates are taxed at a lower rate and individuals like us are taxed at a higher rate, there's a demand for personal income tax to be lower. Right? You can't have the peak rate of taxation for corporates and individual at a different level. You asked one question like, yes, higher indirect taxes when you have inflation going through the roof. And look at whichever year you have the high inflation, that year you're going to have the higher taxes. On top of it, indirect taxes. On top of that, you had high excise duty on petroleum products until November. So that has given lot of tax collection to the government. So in short, yes, there is a scope. Yes, there is some scope, because what we had seen in the GST collection, the 6 months of more than 1 lakh crore month after month is not entirely due to economic buoyancy. it is also, unfortunately, we don't have that number. How much is because of the buoyancy and how much because of improvement or plugging in compliance or plugging in leakages? Because unfortunately, after 5 years, still we are in the GST, that phase of GST, where still it is stabilizing. It hasn't stabilized. So that's what I'll say to begin with.
Okay. Let me come back to you for specific questions. But before that, Mr. Shukla, Mr. Pant seems to suggest that all of this should be up for review. And why not? We're coming off a 2-year pandemic, and hopefully this will be the last year we see it. We need a budget that sets the priorities, let's say, all the way up for the next 5 to 7 years, all the way up to 2030. And the reason I say 2030 is not a political reason, but we have, international commitments when it comes to environment and energy, all the way up to 2030. And those commitments cannot be met unless they're backed fiscally. So in your assessment, do you think this is a good time for the finance ministry, for the government to have relooked at the entire architecture and maybe not make any big steps within this budget, but at least articulate that this is how we're viewing the broad changes that need to take place within taxation? For instance, and let me just add one illustration to that so it becomes clearer to viewers. We have committed to reducing our carbon footprint as an economy by 2030. We do get a not insignificant portion of our tax revenue from taxes on fuels, and we're trying to shift that to green energy. And so therefore, that is going to change the entire mix within revenue itself. So now's the time to start redesigning.
So Menka, thank you so much for not framing this discussion around Section 80C and standard deduction and subsections. So thank you.
Those are also important, but not right now. Yeah.
Right. So I think let me take a couple of steps back, and then we'll come to the tax architecture of the next decade problem. If you look at what we mean by tax fairness, right? It essentially means that it should be based on a person or a company's capacity to pay, right? But at the same time, balanced by the needs of society or needs of the government as a whole for some of these services that the government delivers. Now, it is a fact that India's top line, the tax to GDP ratio has stagnated around 9 to 10%. Even in the best of years, we just about touch that 10% and come back, right? So in those good years, you get corporation tax really shooting through the roof, and you probably get maybe a few basis points above the 10%. But the fact is, 30 years and our top line has really stagnated. So let's look at what the real problems are before we frame the try to look at the architecture. So I think there are two problems of two Ds. The first, Menka, is the denominator problem. If you look at literature worldwide, World Bank, IMF have done a lot of studies, OECD has done a lot of studies. There is a very strong correlation between levels of per capita income and per capita tax collections, right? And there are many, many examples of that around the world. Even in India, when I look at some of the richer states, so look at maybe Maharashtra or Delhi, they're always doing a lot better when it comes to tax to GDP versus a Bihar or whatever state you want to look at, right? So that is something that we need to be very, very cognizant of. Over the last few years, the reason why I'm emphasizing that is the last few years, the denominator has been a problem. So even before the pandemic hit, you'll recall how the GDP growth has continued to come down and per capita incomes have not grown. So I think that is the context that we need to be aware of. The second D, Menka, is the democracy tax. Now, it again is something that we know democracies are susceptible to a lot of redistributive pressures, right? And then there are multiple, pressures on the government to lower the thresholds. So just to give you an example, over the last 3 decades, India has raised its income tax threshold 13 times, right? Whereas China has done probably just about 3 times. And also, Mr. Pant made a very important point that ours is a very, very exclusive sort of a tax regime rather than being inclusive. What I mean is, and he made those qualifications. Agriculture is out. We didn't really tax services, MSMEs, and some of these, even women, for example, Menga. I mean, very low participation rate of women in the workforce. And therefore, if you look at the aggregate pool, so let me give you some numbers. If you look at the active labor force in India, it used to be around 48. Let's assume that last couple of years, because of the pandemic, it has shrunk to say 45 crore. Half of it, for just the sake of argument here, let's not be very precise, half of it, say, for example, is agriculture. We come to just about 23 crore people. And the way the income tax giveaways, I spoke about the redistributive pressures. If you're not taxing incomes above, below 5 lakhs, we end up with just about 1.5 crore people, 1.46 crore people paying taxes out of 5.8 who really pay taxes. So I think this is something, the 2 Ds, that we need to be very, very cognizant of. And the other bit I think is also probably flowing from this is that difference between nominal tax rates and effective tax rates. In India, it's huge. I mean, you look at any other comparable economy, the nominal tax rate is something, but because of the way we have designed over the years and could not resist this urge of tinkering every budget, what we end up doing is the effective tax rate is something else, the nominal is something else. And therefore, whether it is direct taxes, whether it is indirect taxes, the kind of revenues that we get is that the top line is just about 9 or 10%, refuses to budge. Going forward, I definitely think we have to look at some of these hard realities. We have international commitments, like you said, and there will be a time where we'll have to think of imposition of, say, something like a carbon tax. We'll have to think of doing the GST bit better. We'll probably come to that in a bit. But I think we'll have to look at the entire architecture through the prism of these 2 Vs. Back to you, Vinka.
Okay, so both of you seem to broadly agree that maybe this is the appropriate time, and I don't mean just this budget, but broadly speaking, the post-pandemic period, given that there is the need for support to several segments of the economy, given what they've suffered over the last 3-4 years with slowing growth, some of the effect of GST on the informal sector, demonetization, but mostly the 2 years of the pandemic. So the timing is right. Now, here's a very narrow, short-term, budget-oriented question. If this is the right timing to be thinking of redesigning the tax system, then where should the government start? Very quickly, if each one of you could sort of lay out what you think would give you confidence to hear from the finance minister that suggests to you that we are seeking to achieve what both of you have spoken about. Mr. Shukla?
So, Menka, if you look at the reality of today as we speak, of this budget, the fact is we have seen the government really give away a lot of these, I spoke about the redistributive pressures, bulk of the population filing tax returns, less than 5 lakhs, you're not supposed to pay any taxes. At the same time, if you're earning above rupees 50 lakhs, every single rupee beyond that, you're paying 42.7 roughly, right? That's the kind of taxation that you have imposed on the higher end. Now, if you have a system wherein a small portion of individual taxpayers is going to be paying the bulk of it, right? Bearing the brunt of it, it is sort of very, very inequitable. And you are relying on a very small labor pool, salaried labor pool for your taxation efforts. Looking at the way private consumption has behaved, it is still far below the pre-pandemic levels. I would believe one way on the direct side, taxation side, is to give something, leave more money in pockets. Now, whether it is standard deduction, whether it is something for housing interest or principal, I don't know how they want to do it. But the fact is, there has to be some giveaway to the middle class or this small proportion of labor, salaried labor, where you're trying to get exaggerated amounts of taxes from. The other is on the indirect taxes. Now, I understand this is not within the ambit of the budget, but I think there has to be some recognition and some statement around the fact that GST has failed to deliver what it was supposed to deliver. As we speak, the GST is still giving us, so I mean, I've seen those numbers, 1.3 lakh crore and all of that, but the fact is, even then, it is delivering 1% percent of GDP less than what it has subsumed, right? So, I mean, this is something that we need to look at. The revenue neutral rate is something that we have to revisit, and there has to be some sort of a statement from the government in terms of whether they want to address it or not. So the weighted average GST rate, 14.4 or 14.5, it has actually come down to effectively 11.6 or 11.5. And therefore, if this is one of your biggest, say, tax reforms, and it is still not delivering what it was supposed to, I think we need to re-examine this. So two things that I'm saying. On the direct tax side, we have to look at giving something just to begin with, I mean, for this budget, so that we are back on even keel in terms of the denominator. So I'm tying it back to the denominator growth, because that
but
is...
if I can interrupt you there, is the middle class really the people that deserve that relief in this budget?
Okay, so I would
know
say...
it's a broader economic question of where the maximum pain has been, but the briefest answer that you can give me to that.
Okay, so I'll tell you, there has been this emphasis from the government to deliver some of this in kind. So we know that the government has been giving free food. There has been some quasi UBI for farmers, PM Kisan, and there has been some sort of plumbing on the informal economy, especially the agrarian economy, where the government has been able to deliver something. Where it has not been able to deliver is the urban, and you're right, that do salaried or do some of these people deserve. But I think the point is, in the absence of a plumbing for having an urban Manrega, I mean, I'm just using that as a, for the lack of better words. We don't have the plumbing there. We don't have the number of beneficiaries and the list of beneficiaries. States are not in. I think till the point we get there, this is the only place where you have some sort of plumbing. This is the place where this can give you some delta in terms of the denominator growth via private consumption expenditure. And therefore, I'm making this suggestion, knowing fully well, I mean, I take your point that this probably is not the neediest segment in the economy, but for the lack of alternatives, for the lack of, say, plumbing on the urban Manrega side, you will have to start somewhere. And this is where you need to start, because private final consumption expenditure has remained far lower than any other segment in the economy when you look at the GDP numbers or GVA numbers. Also, it is important from CAPEX perspective. So while the government will try and talk about borrowing and spending on infra, but the point is, look at capacity utilization levels. Still 60s, right? I mean, mid 60s or thereabout, barring a few sectors. Unless you have demand coming back up again, private capex will not really follow suit. I mean, you're still looking at maybe another 18 odd months before you see that in a big way. So I think to fill that gap and get the denominator working, I think this is where you can start, because this is where you have the wherewithal and the required plumbing to start your efforts.
Okay, and one quick other very short follow-up question. You referenced the GST revenue neutral rate. And you said that right now the weighted average rate has come down to 11.5%. So what you're suggesting is that we need to hike GST rates. Have I got that right?
So yes, in the broadest sense.
I'll
Yes.
come back to the question in more detail, but what you're suggesting is a higher, sort of weighted average GST rate, right?
Yes, because there have been a lot of giveaways, and like I said, every budget we try to tinker and give away something.
So either it means moving more products into the higher bands, or it just means,
reducing the slabs, revisiting the slab.
The weight towards 18% than otherwise. Okay,
Right.
Let me come back to Mr. Pant on this. Mr. Pant, how are you viewing the question of timing? Can the budget do anything to address this, given that we're still in post-pandemic recovery stage, and maybe some of the things that Mr. Shukla are talking about are intuitive, but they could also be considered by many, or argued by many, as being inequitable, because at this time it is a different segment of society that needs the help the most. And again, raising GST rates at a time when inflation is a concern, and it's not the most progressive ways of raising tax revenue, would just add to the problem.
Well, Minka, I agree with some of the prognosis of Sachchidanand.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have to have, especially you have to have faster consumption growth in order to use the idle capacities, and then only you will have at economy level, at macro level, more capex or more investment growth coming in, investment led, which is more sustainable. Now, if you look at, say, from 2012, 11, 12 to 2019, 20, when you have some detailed data on how the wages at the economy level have behaved, and both wages growth and private final consumption expenditure growth, both in the nominal terms, have trended downward from 2011-12 to 2019-20. We'll get 2021 data maybe in a week or 10 days time from now, and we'll be able to see, because 2021 is going to give you all sorts of things. Savings rate going up, household savings rate going up, doesn't mean that households are out of foods. So when I'm referring to household, I'm referring to household as the economic agent, which are neither private corporate, not public corporate, not the government, whatever left. So it has most of the MSMEs, etc., etc. There is compelling reason because corporate tax rate has been reduced, and household individual taxation rate is much higher than the peak corporate tax rate. So there is a compelling reason. Will it resolve problem? Will it solve problem? Unlikely, because what it is going to do, if all three of us whose faces we can see each other's faces, if all three of us are given 1 lakh rupee rebate, how many of us, whether we are going to spend that 3 lakh? Answer is no, because the marginal propensity to consume as we go up the income ladder is reduces.
Yeah.
But if that 3 lakh is given to 10 people, 30,000 each, most likely, and those people have marginal propensity to consume equivalent to 1, so most likely that they will spend. But the problem is how to identify those people in urban area and how to give it, which form and how it will happen. Will it something like as Sachchidanand rightly said, and it has been talked, people are talking about it, many economists have talked about it in the last 2 years, the urban Manrega or whatever one they say. So kind of jobs which Manrega in the rural Manrega is done, in urban areas, who does it? Municipal corporations. So are we targeting those jobs which are done by the municipal corporations? And can those kind of jobs which is done under Manrega at rural area, can the similar jobs be done in the urban area? It is very difficult. So from the practical point of view of the implementation, it's a good thing to do the urban Manrega or a similar thing in urban area. But what are we going to do? What kind of assets we are going to play?
That debate is played out. So let me bring you back to tax. Given that we all agree that this is maybe the right time to start thinking about redesigning India's taxation, is there anything immediate that you might expect in this budget that serves that broader purpose, even while it's not doing anything negative, hurting, or maybe even benefiting some of the other issues that we've just discussed, whether it's consumption, and demand?
Further simplification or in reducing the compliance, because we had already seen the kind of compliance reduction.
Hear you correctly? Is that what you said? Reducing compliance.
Reducing compliance further. Reducing compliance further. There was talk of direct tax code in the previous regime. We hear about it in the new regime also. Can we have some more easy in some more compliance reduction for the simplification of compliance? If we compare it this present day's time or last 1 decade or so, in income tax compliance compared to say 2 decades back or 3 decades back, we have come a long way. But there is still some more which can be done.
Okay.
GST, whether yes, it is not able to achieve what it was supposed to achieve. But is it the entire effort in the GST implementation was on making sure that it is non-inflationary? If the entire effort was on making it non-inflationary, it is bound to give us less revenue. Because if you look at the time of GST implementation, or the time GST came on, was implemented, the 12% was the CAGR of tax subsumed in GST at state level, keeping latest year's budget estimate numbers. But the moment you replace those budget estimates by the actual, that growth falls down to somewhere closer to 10%. So the 14%. So was it because it should not be inflationary, and because of which we are seeing the region that GST collections are low? Now, is it there's some more of reforms are required, whereby you can improve compliance in the GST before you start tinkering with the rate? Because if we start tinkering with rates before knowing what is the true capacity or potential of GST, it will be a futile exercise to change those rates, because again
So you're saying don't tinker with rates right now.
Right now, let's see what is the
systems settle down. Let's see what the best compliance outcomes are, and then rework GST.
Yeah. Because in the falling growth, when our consumption is in FY22 as per NSO will be 2.9% lower than FY20, we can have this kind of GST collection growth. Means there is true potential is not yet achieved. Let's first achieve it, and then we should look at tinkering the rates. Okay. That's what my suggestion will be.
Since both of your responses have put GST front and center, it was going to be my last question, but I'll move it up. I'm a little confused about what this GST reform is supposed to bring, because I thought that we were eventually, when we did GST 2.0, we'd do fewer rates and lower rates. And now the conversation has moved to, yes, fewer rates, but higher rates. As both of you have just endorsed in your answers as well. And let me go back to a comment that Vivek De Broglie, the chairman of the PMEAC, made recently. He said it's not only about integrating more products and services under the GST framework, it's also about the GST rate. The GST was originally formulated. When it was originally formulated, the revenue neutral rate was expected to be around 18%. Today, the average GST rate is about 11.5%, as Mr. Shukla pointed out. So that clearly is not tenable. Both of you are talking about raising the GST rate as part of the GST 2.0 reform that is required. Now, I don't know if the government has the gumption to do that at a time like this, when inequality and inflation are already top concerns. And let's not forget that in India, 50% of our tax revenue comes from indirect sources and 50% from direct. And many might say that's not progressive enough, a tax system, Mr. Shukla.
Very true, Menka. I'll just come back to the denominator problem. Let's first recognize where we are and what are the demands. So 5 years hence, 10 years hence, the demands on the government for spending on education, on health, like we've seen, these are only going to grow. And there are multiple other commitments that will come in, global commitments as well. So on the GST piece, let's first get back to where we were. I mean, the entire idea of this reform was that it will subsume taxes. There'll be ideally one tax, or maybe even two, say, tax rates. But see, I made that point about inclusive and exclusive. Our taxation effort is exclusive. In GST also, what have you done? Fuel, energy, all of these are still separate. And then you got a bouquet where you could not resist the temptation of lowering it every subsequent budget. And eventually, you're getting just 11.5% effective tax rate. And that is just too low for the demands of this economy. The point I'm making is it can be done two ways, right? You raise the rate or get other things like energy and some of these things, which are very, very tricky, right? State governments don't really want to compromise. The center also will take a big hit. We have been discussing this with the people in the government, and Niti Aayog has been a votary of this, that let's subsume some of these other things, and then you come to actually something which you can really call GST, right? Goods and services tax, harmonized rate and harmonized tax. I think we've not even gone back to where we were. And then we are talking about some of these things, say from a decadal or a 5 to 10 year perspective.
Mr. Shukla, can I throw one more complication into this GST mix? And that is the fact that given the experience of the last 2 years on compensation cess, we now have states demanding that compensation cess should be extended all the way up to 2027. So we had thought originally that in 5 years, this cess will die, allowing us to take some goods out of the top taxed rates and clean up the structure. And that ain't going to happen. And like you pointed out, I don't think at this point in time, given the state-center relationships, that they're going to want to give up their right to tax fuel. So is there a fix at all? And whilst I understand that the fix may lie within the aegis of the GST Council, is there a fix that you expect the finance minister to directionally point towards in this budget?
So Menka, yes, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program or a cess or whatever you call it, right? We've seen that globally. The point is, can we arrive at a mutually satisfactory understanding? There are multiple suggestions around. These are tricky, but I'm very sure that there has to be a give and take. There could be a 5-year period where you come to an understanding. Let's say energy taxes, right? Can we get it in the GST fold and have a carbon tax? I mean, you call it whatever, something like a carbon tax. And I'm sure, and we have worked something with some people in the government, there is a way out, and it just requires the right kind of give and take and dialogue. So if the question is, can it happen? I'm very sure it can happen. Will it get prolonged? Like I said, in a democracy, we pay the tax, democracy tax, right? Things get prolonged. Something that's supposed to happen in 1 year maybe happens in 5 years or 10 years. But I'm very sure that we'll get there. We have lost a lot of time, but let's look at it holistically. As we move towards greener fuels and stuff like that, the world moves to an entirely different, let's call it uncharted in certain ways. Will your reliance on oil taxes, I mean, what will that yield to you as a central government or state government? So tomorrow, when the industry dies, I mean, how are you going to get that revenue? And it is substantial. You've seen that over the last few years, how much money the government has got from excise, ditto for state governments via their, say, taxation powers. So the point I'm making is, the writing is on the wall. We will have to come to an agreement. We have to get more products and more services into the fold. Even as we speak, GST gives us less than 3% of GDP, right? Which is a pittance. I mean, the kind of economy we are, I mean, 60% comes from services and all of that. And the writing is on the wall. If you move towards a certain trajectory, there is no way out. You'll have to get things within the fold, and you have to get what you have lost, first of all, and then move beyond that. On the direct tax bit, I completely agree with you and Mr. Pant. It has to be a holistic effort. I mean, I spoke about the necessity for the year and a half now because private consumption is weak. But there is no running away from the fact that you need a holistic direct tax code sort of an effort. I don't know why this has not happened, or I understand some of these difficulties in this, but it has to be a holistic thing. And let's think of the biggest thing, the denominator. Whichever ratio, whatever you talk about in macro, whatever the numerator is, unless you get your denominator moving, none of these are really going to work.
I'm smiling when you say direct tax code, because It's been 20 years, we've discussed one, right? And this a Friday evening is definitely not the time to go back down that road. But let me ask you this, Mr. Pant. How does one look at the ratios, right? In India, this year at least, 50% of our tax revenue will come from indirect and 50% will come from direct. Now, if we're talking about reforming GST, whereby rates increase and we're able to yield more revenue from GST, then this will actually skew more in favor of indirect. Is that progressive? Because from what I understand, the more progressive way of taxation and raising revenue is through the income tax route and not through the consumption tax route, right?
You're right, Monica. But let me clear one thing. In my earlier submission, I never talked about raising the GST. I said till it is settles down,
Okay.
till the optimum tax collection with the whatever form we have, until unless that is achieved, please don't tinker with rates.
Okay. Okay.
Right?
So,
Now
so
coming
you're
to
not pushing for a rate increase in GST.
not right now
But
until
the
unless
core question still remains 50-50.
Yeah.
How should we
Yeah.
view the mix between direct and indirect, right?
Look, yeah, you're right. A higher level of indirect taxes is more aggressive because what it does is whatever is earned by people at the bottom of the pyramid, because their savings are almost negligible or nil, you are taxing everything. But what we have seen is the recent phenomena of having higher indirect taxes is because of certain factors. One, the dip in the corporate tax collection, a decline, reduction in corporate tax rate. Second is high tax on excise on fuel. Right? These are two major reasons. And then what if you see as I was mentioning in national accounts data shows that the wages growth has been on a declining path from FY12 onwards. Now, because of that, what is happening, the amount which you are taxing as an income tax, that is not growing at the same proportion. Whereas, because of higher inflation, especially in this year, your consumption is growing in the nominal term because of higher inflation, and since taxes are levied on the nominal, you are getting a higher indirect taxation. So if we increase GST rate further, we will be having more and more of indirect taxes compared to direct taxes.
Correct.
So what is required? How can we increase taxes? And also the direct taxes. Right? A, how the industrialization can be improved in this economy. Because we are languishing in low industrial proportion in the GVA from areas.
Okay.
When we had the new base year and the methodology was changed, I'm not saying that was some boundary, but even then from 16% it went up to closer to 20-odd%. It has remained almost flat. It has remained almost flat, and it is the only place where when you want to talk about take out people out of agriculture, where you'll find a place is the shop floor. Right? And more that will grow. Your formalization of the economy has to go up. And what happens is that the MSME starts getting achieving economies of scale. They are getting bigger and moving from MSME to the formal sector. That is the one which is going to give you more on the direct taxes.
And you listed that as A, but Mr. Pant, that's a long process for any economy. We need more tax revenue.
What is problem, what is happening is because these are the long processes, so we are not attempting that. Okay. There has to be a date, a month, a year when the beginning has to be made. unless next generation will be discussing, otherwise the next generation of ours will be discussing the
Would
same
you
matter.
would you count the government's efforts towards PLI schemes, Make in India, etc., as efforts to push this formalization, to expand manufacturing in the country, and therefore sufficient to deal with the first concern that you raised?
Yes, in medium to long term,
Okay.
but I hope it is not the other form of import substitution of 1970s.
So what
If it is again import substitution,
I understand your fears about import substitution. What would the answer be to your point about how do we expand the industrial base so we can get more corporate tax revenue? What would it be within the budget that you would want to see that suggests to you that the government is thinking exactly in the same way that you are?
well, Menika, the problem is now we are trying to find out all answers in budget speech or in the budget.
Okay, well,
it's a work in progress. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so you can have look, you can start. Do we have anywhere in what are the sectors where we have the advantage, competitive advantage over the other economies?
Okay.
Now, wherever we have the competitive advantage, will it work for export or will it work for domestic consumption? So whichever way, if you are exporting or whether you are producing for the domestic production, indirect way domestic production, because we were not doing it till now. So that is one way, because it is not one step which has to be taken. There are many small steps which has to be
So
taken.
industrialization is point A. Was there a point B and C you wanted to add to this, sir?
The simplification of
corporate tax-based revenue, right?
Yeah. Simplification of or improvement in tax compliance, so direct tax code or whatever, whereby the compliance goes down. And once see, ultimately at the end of the day, what Sachchidanand is also talking about, denominator is nothing but until unless economy is on stable growth path. We have to put economy. The simple one-point solution for every problem is higher economic growth. And how can we achieve it? Can we bring back our household sector again to the back situation where the savings rate was 23.6% in FY12 compared to 19.6% today in FY20? How can we bring that MSME sector and reduce pain of that MSME sector back? If we reduce the pain of MSME sector, household, maximum contribution to gross value addition, maximum contribution to saving, maximum contribution to the investment, only institution in the economy which have surplus savings or positive saving investment gap, and that is financing negative saving investment gap of public corporate, private corporate, and the general government. And if that is falling, you are seeing impact on the interest rate in the economy. So bring that back, you will have that higher saving, you will have even impact on the interest rate in the economy, which is quote unquote outside the scope of this discussion.
I was going to say this discussion is moot now, Mr. Shukla, because Mr. Pant has said we shouldn't be discussing taxes, we should be discussing growth. But I do have one last final question, right? And I bring it back to the budget because we're just days away from that. GST reform necessary, maybe compliance needs to first catch up, but eventually we need to raise the rates. Not going to happen till the government feels both inflation and equality in a place where they can be justified to do this. Actually, honestly, given the election cycle that's going on, doubt it's going to happen at all over the next 2 or 3 years, let's be honest. Personal income tax is never something that any government wants to tinker with, at least definitely on the upside. They can't afford to do anything on the downside because like we've already discussed, the denominator is already suffering. So that only just leaves us with corporate income taxes. Now, world over, the consensus seems to be that the race to the bottom when it comes to corporate income taxes is over now. Many countries are saying 20%, 21%, 22%. We can't cut any further than that because we desperately need revenue to be able to fund all our economic requirements. Do you see a turnaround in the mood on corporate income tax rates?
Let's also look at the reality that we have today. There are a couple of other line items in the indirect taxation, right? Customs. It's come down to just 0.5% of GDP. The average, decadal averages have been 1.2 and all of that. Going forward, the way the world is protectionist, and also the focus is on getting into some of these bilateral or multilateral trade treaties. The chances are that you'll never go back to those peaks, right? Or even increase revenues from there. The other bit is excise that you've seen exaggerated revenues coming from. And you cannot, again, with like the populace, the pressure on the government, given elections and all of that, and this entire halla gulla on fuel taxes, I don't think, again, that you will gain more from there, and especially with crude prices also going up. So excise gone as incremental revenue driver, and also customs, really, you don't have much leeway if you think about it from a 5-year, 10-year perspective as well. So the only thing you come back to is the GST bit, right? And again, there, I think there is still a lot of leeway in terms of designing and implementing that policy. And then there's an entire discussion in itself as to how the machinery or the way things are done.
Can I briefly interrupt you before you go on to the GST details? Why do you say that's the only thing? Why is it that we cannot rethink the corporate tax rate? I know it's only 2019 that we cut it, and we offered a SOP to new manufacturing units.
Okay.
Let that SOP stay. But do you think maybe there is an opportunity here to consider reversing the corporate tax rate cuts? Controversial, I know. Still asking you.
So Menka, I was on the indirect taxes so far. Let me address.
Okay, fair enough. All right. You'll come to it then. All right.
Yeah, so let me address the corporate tax bit and the personal income tax. So if I look at the last 10 years, income taxes for every, say, unit of GDP have given you about 2.6, 2.5 times. It's grown in that proportion. Corporate tax, and you can probably say that because of the giveaway that the government has done to make the Indian economy or the corporates more competitive, etc., it is about 1.5, 1.6, right? So the point I'm making is there is hardly anything that you can do, and this is why I spoke about giving some relief to this particular class, because you maxed out. The only place where you can get some revenues from incrementally is corporation tax, and for that you need domestic demand, you need the economy to fire, and otherwise this say 10-year period that I spoke about, corporate taxes have underperformed the personal income tax, which ideally is not something that you see in the Indian economy or economies like this. So I think there are things that need to be done before the corporate tax number gives you the required bang for the buck. Similarly, on the GST side, there is still that 1% that we are lacking. So I think let's come back to normalcy. And the answer is, I know the holy grail is growth. Unless you see some semblance of normalcy in terms of domestic demand, it can't be a yo-yo. We've seen this because of the pandemic. And also prior to that, consumption demand has been extremely weak. And household balance sheets are under tremendous pressure. And we cannot have this consumption-based economy really going back to where we were without some support on consumption. So I understand infra, I understand the multipliers that we have, 3.4 or whatever. But the point is, there is a bridge to cross. Before that starts to give you that bang for the buck, the infra or the capex bit, you need this consumption engine to stabilize. I'm not saying fire. And therefore, we will need some semblance of normalcy in consumption demand before your corporate taxes also start giving you
so your pitch for at least the budget is that the one thing this budget can do is give away a little bit more money in the hands of the middle class through tax changes.
Not just
back to ATC. ATC or ATCC. We didn't intend to discuss that, but that's where we've come back, right?
Yes, yes.
How
I mean,
about
absolutely. I think that is something that we need to get out of the way before we try and attempt some of these. The other thing, Menka, this budget can do. The last budget, there was this confusion whether you want to opt for A or B, right? I think one thing they can clearly say that exemptions are completely out, and it's not on you or me to decide this or that. I think let's get that out of the way. I think that inclusive versus exclusive and the effective versus nominal tax rate, let's get those confusions out of the way. Let's be clear about things. And I think that is one thing that this budget can signal, that confusion, etc., is gone. Let's be very clear where we want to go.
Okay, fair enough. We're already out of time. Mr. Pant, I'll give you the last word, just 30 seconds. If there was one thing you thought that the finance minister could do in this budget that suggests that she's thinking about all the things that you, me, and Mr. Shukla have discussed over the last 45 minutes, what would it be?
Steps to reduce pain on MSMEs.
Okay. You don't mean just tax point of view. You mean economic support as well.
Everything. How can we bring them back on track?
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on this sort of, like I said, fuzzy conversation that we didn't think would come down to ATC, but it eventually has just done that. Mr. Shukla, Mr. Pant, thank you very much for joining me this evening on BloombergQuint, and I'm sure we will hear from you right after the budget speech to see if the finance minister has in fact delivered on some of these expectations. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you.